Okay.
Speaking, Jonah, could you
Hello, Eric. Can you hear me? Is this good?
go ahead and speak to the world and the audience?
Okay. All right. Hello, world. Hello, audience. Thank you very much for coming. Yes, thank you. It's good to see everybody here. Thank you, Eric, for making the time and space available to us. So, my name is Jonah Raskin. Sitting right next to me is Steve Wasserman. He's the publisher at Heyday, which I'm sure you've all have heard about. You have some big fans of Heyday here, right? Rightly so. It's a nonprofit independent press. It was founded in Berkeley in 1974, and it's still going strong.
It's still going very strong.
Yes.
Yes.
Steve is a graduate of UC Berkeley. He's a former editor of the Los Angeles Times Book Review. He was also a publisher of Hill and Wang, a division of Forrest Strauss Giroux, and an editorial director of Times Books, a former imprint of Random House. He was a partner of Knirim.
Near
Knirim.
Yeah.
Knirim and Williams, a literary agency where he represented numerous authors, including Bob Scheer, Christopher Hitchens, David Thompson, Linda Ronstadt, and James Fenton. And he lives in Berkeley.
That's correct.
Is that it? Is that all?
That's correct. It just goes to show you that I'm determined to work every station in the publishing kitchen before I'm done. Yeah. So.
All right. Okay. Well, it's impressive. You've been in a lot of good places and published a lot of good books.
Well, thank you. I need every reader I can get.
Okay. And then on Steve's right is Garrett Caples. He's a poet. He lives in San Francisco. His most recent book of poems is titled Lovers of Today. It's published by Wave Books. It came out last year in 2021. Come on in, have a seat. We're just getting started. I'm just making the introductions. Garrett is an editor at City Lights Booksellers and Publishers. He curates the Spotlight Poetry series. He's worked with Beat Generation legends such as Michael McClure, Diane DePrima, David Meltzer, and Joanne Kiger. He occasionally served as Lawrence Ferlinghetti's personal assistant. He's edited several books by Philip Lamantia. So that last part, I would say, Garrett, to me, is the most impressive part.
To me too.
Putting Philip Lamantia in print.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's he was a friend of mine late in his life, and so it was like a responsibility to make sure his work was put together in a fashion that we thought was, correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and Philip and Jack were close for some of the time. They were two Catholic boys.
Yes.
Who
Yes.
strayed from Catholicism and maybe came back to it.
Oh yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes, I believe like Philip, I don't know how far into his life, but he did go back to the church.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, his late, the time that I knew him, he was pretty deeply into Catholicism, and I Irish Catholic myself, so he was able to sort of converse about this with me, and I think that's one of the reasons why I was lucky enough to be his friend, because I knew about poetry, but I also could talk about Catholicism with him,
Yeah, that's handy. Yeah. I would
Yeah.
say so.
Yeah, we went to mass with him a couple times.
I usually go for like Ash Wednesday, and, Easter Sunday, just to stay honest. St. Mary's, it's huge. Up on the hill there. So before, you were saying that Kerouac what the image that came to mind. He was kind of a sea that you swam in. Or maybe is there another
Yeah,
image?
I
or-
mean that's good enough. I mean, do you want me to
yeah,
go
yeah,
here?
you're right,
Because I can. Yeah, I can. I'm not going to read this. I just wrote things out so I could think it through. But
yeah.
I brought this because it's it's the oldest book I own, or a book I've owned the longest. I own older books, but not. This is a paperback, Black Cat paperback of the Subterraneans that came out in like 1981 or something. I got it in 1987 when I was 15, and it's the first thing I read by Kerouac, and I was totally hooked. I mean, Kerouac made me want to be a writer. I previously, I wanted to be like a rock musician like everybody else when I was a kid.
rock star, yes,
yeah,
of course,
and
yeah.
that I knew I was no good, at music, and I didn't have an ear, I could tell, I couldn't really tell if something's on a tune, that type of stuff,
Yeah.
So, but I knew I knew how to write. And I read that book, and I'm like, oh, this looks like fun. The writing seems like it. There's sex and drugs, just like in rock music, and it seemed more suited to my talents. So in this respect, Kerouac's had like a kind of determinative role in my whole life. Because so I'm not the most successful writer in the world, but I'm, by any sort of professional metric of being a writer, I have succeeded in becoming one.
You're published,
Yeah.
and your people
I'm
read
published.
you.
I have a publisher, and I work at an
Yeah.
even more prestigious publisher.
Yeah.
So I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
And so it's I'm kind of lucky. This dream I had when I was 15, I've been able to realize it to some extent. And and it wasn't like the only thing I read at the time, but it, I was pretty obsessed. It was the stuff I identified with. But that, I remember then reading Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, and I was kind of disconcerted because I'm like, I really like this too. And it didn't make sense to me at the time. Like, why do I like this tale of oppressed young womanhood on the Yorkshire moors? Like, why am I,
Yeah.
And what I didn't sort of get back then, or when it was the beginning of the process of me getting the fact that there's something about writing itself that's more important to me than necessarily what the topic of a given piece of writing is.
Right. The
And-
process?
Or just the writing itself, like just the in Kerouac's case, just the way he writes. It's like it almost doesn't matter what he's talking about, that he his just as a man who puts together sentences, he's really kind of an amazing writer. And so I read a bunch back then, even though it was a lot harder to find the more obscure stuff back then. Now you can kind of get it all, but in the '80s it was not easy. And I grew up near Lowell.
Oh, you
a lot
did?
of my
Oh.
family's from Lowell, and no one in Lowell cared about Kerouac. I mean, it was before when I was a kid. Like nobody cared. They didn't even have the memorial yet. It
Right.
took a long time
Yeah.
for the city to warm up to
Interesting.
to him.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the like late '70s, early '80s, nothing.
Well, a lot of Kerouac was out of print.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I read what I could get my hands on, which was the sort of obvious stuff. But I'm kind of weird because I started with the Subterraneans. Most people start with On the Road, I think, but it was much better cover. Like really, like the
Yeah.
the cover of On the Road back then was really crappy. It was that kind of sunset one. That was the only edition you could get for a long time. It was just like a sort of orange sunset, and it wasn't that evocative. Whereas this seemed pretty evocative of a lifestyle or something like that.
Yeah.
And so it didn't stay my obsession in a way, because when I met Philip Lamantia, I was interested in, and still am. My writing is much more involved with like surrealism, say, and but it was an interesting coincidence that this was the one surrealist who was also a member of the, well, not the one, because you could say Bob Kaufman maybe too, but
Yeah.
who was considered a Beat Generation writer. And you know what? When I reread this to do this event, and I was kind of surprised by just how sordid the Subterraneans is. It's like, why did I think this was so fun? Because it seems it's miserable. I mean, it's a really tragic story, and it's a self-inflicted tragedy largely. Like that he can't accept this relationship for what it is, and he has all these things that screw it up, and he has about half a dozen opportunities to like fix things, and he doesn't really get it until it's too late, and so I was kind of surprised by just how not fun it seemed as an adult. Like having read it, it seemed very tragic, but it seemed good though. I mean, it's not that it was bad literature, but it was like I don't know why it seemed like such an interesting way to live back then.
So Garrett, how old did you say you were when
15,
you first?
15,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So you don't, it's like I didn't really understand a lot of it, and what I figured when I was reading it, I'm like, I think the thing that must have been really fun in this book was the pushcart incident, what's known as the pushcart incident, and so I'm waiting for that, and I read it, and I read right through it, and it's still awful and miserable and sordid, the whole thing. And so I went back after I finished it. I went back to that passage and really looked at it, and I thought I'd read 2 sentences from that because, the scenario is Leo, which is Kerouac's character based on himself, and Mardot. They're having an interracial romance. Leo is white and Mardot is black, and they're out drinking with somebody named Yuri Gligoric, who is a stand-in for Gregory Corso. And then this episode begins. Going thence to the mask as usual, beers, get worse drunk, then walk out to go home. Yuri, having just arrived from Oregon, having no place to sleep, is asking if it's all right to sleep at our place. I let Mardot speak for her own house, though feebly say some okay in the middle of the confusion, and Yuri comes heading home with us. En route finds a pushcart, says, "Get in, I'll be a taxicab and push you both up the hill." Okay, we get in, and we lie on our backs, drunk as you can only get drunk on red wine, and he pushes us from the beach at that fateful park where we'd sat that first sad Sunday afternoon of my dream and premonitions, and we ride along in the pushcart of eternity, Angel Yuri pushing it. I can only see stars and occasional rooftops of blocks. No thought in any mind, except in mine, briefly, possibly in others, of the sin, the loss entailed for the poor Italian beggar losing his cart there. On down Broadway, clear to Mardot's in the pushcart. At one point I push and they ride, Mardot and I singing bop, and also bop to the tune of Are the Stars Out Tonight, and just drunk, parking foolishly in front of Adams and rushing up, making noise. And like, that second sentence, I mean, there's really like, that first sentence is really like, 2 sentences really, and and the second sentence is really about 3 all kind of mashed together, with no stops. And I feel like it's a feeling of that sentence is what made me think it was so fun, that it was much more about the writing itself than it was about what is being depicted to me. And but this kind of brief flash of joy in the middle of what's a pretty sad novel overall, sort of colored my whole perception and memory of the thing. It's a great sentence. I mean, there's a lot in there that you would call a beat cliche now, but the things that are beat cliches are just the original parts of Kerouac that kind of lent themselves to imitation and parody. They weren't cliches when he made these things. And he's also working through influences like Joyce and Thomas Wolfe, doing kind of interior monologue and kind of blending it with those kind of non-narrative passages in Look Homeward, Angel. Like he sort of takes that kind of poetic style and puts it towards narrative, which is one of the interesting things he does. So, I mean, that's a start, anyways, in terms of how I got how I was interested in that, and it's kind of come back to haunt me ever since in a way because I, without meaning to, I end up getting as an adult getting involved first with Philip, and then after Philip died, I helped his widow Nancy Peters, who also was the executive director at City Lights. She's retired now, and she owns part of it. And she kind of brought me in, and I was doing office work. But then I helped. I put together an edition of this unpublished manuscript of Philip's from 1955 called Tau, and we put those poems with these poems by John Hoffman, who was a friend of his who died in 1952. And the John Hoffman poems are the ones Philip actually reads at the Sixth Gallery when Ginsberg debuts Howl. And, one thing kind of led to another at City Lights, and I ended up, I ended up becoming an editor there. I'm not really an employee, but I'm really an editor. I'm carrying half the list this season.
Great,
so
great.
it's I've done about 60 books.
That's
more,
a lot.
Yeah,
That's a
for
lot of
City
books.
Lights since
Wow.
since that first book was probably 2008 or something.
Yeah, I interviewed Ferlinghetti once for the Chronicle.
Oh yeah.
And I said, well, Lawrence, there's when you were as a publisher, is anything that you regretted? And he said, yeah, I regret that I didn't publish Kerouac earlier on. But I think, a lot of publishers had that feeling.
Yeah, I think there were some regrets there. There were things, he said he didn't quite get some of it at the time, or I think he felt that way a little bit with Burroughs too. That he could have had more of a crack at both of those authors. He does end up publishing Kerouac, but there's some. It's hard to say, especially now that Lawrence is dead. Whether did Lawrence really have a chance to publish On the Road? I don't know, but it's good that he didn't. Because it wouldn't, it wouldn't have gone the way it went. I don't think if he had. A lot of it depended on it coming out through. I guess it was Viking or Random House or whatever.
Yeah.
Coming out through Viking.
Yeah,
And,
New York publisher.
Yeah, it depended on it being a New York publisher and then getting that massive review in the New York Times.
Yes.
And, it's like this. Howl happened, but that's poetry. It's different. It's a different kind of economy than the world of novels. And I don't think, because I know to this day it is still hard for City Lights to get New York press.
Yeah,
and I don't think it would have had anywhere near the impact if Lawrence had published
I could see that. Yeah.
it.
A lot of fortunate coincidences with, especially getting reviewed in the New York Times.
Yeah.
And going to the bestseller list.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think in a certain way, there are regrets, but it's also like it kind of happened the way it had to happen in order for it to have the kind of impact it had.
So I wrote something about Kerouac for the Examiner recently, and the editor wrote me and said that her grandfather rejected On the Road when he was at Forest Strauss. and I wrote back to her, emailed and said, well, but the manuscript was probably a mess when when her grandfather got it, and he thought, well, what can I do with this thing?
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing. Again, if you put On the Road against Subterraneans, in many ways, the Subterraneans is a more satisfying work of art than On the Road. It's got a kind of unity of mood and concision that, and a focus that On the Road kind of lacks, and I don't think most editors would have looked at On the Road and didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah, exactly. So, Steve, you're listening to this. Is this stirring up any of your thoughts or feelings about Kerouac, or where do you want to jump into all this? Do you want to tell us how you connected to Jack?
I think Kerouac is one of the most overrated writers in American literature. And the bewildering thing is that he has now been turned into Saint Jack. The hagiography that has now become a kind of propaganda for a generation that was devoted to its persistent self-aggrandizement may have been the first generation which understood that the media was everything, and that the navel-gazing quality that would make of their accomplishments, however small, however large, however mediocre, however inflected by genius, as synonymous with the American condition, though not admitted during the years of the Cold War and the somnolent 50s, but emerges as avatars of restlessness and velocity that somehow is baked into a permanent sense of the enduring adolescence of the country, has made of his work the perfect bonbon for 15-year-olds, particularly 15-year-old boys.
Yes, yes.
I too read on the Road when I was 15. The year was 10 years after its first publication in 1957. By the way, Roger Strauss did not turn down On the Road. No. Robert Giroux, his partner, turned it down. Okay. Robert Giroux had been the editor previously at Houghton Mifflin and had published Jack Kerouac's first book, The Town and Country, or whatever it was called. City, and which was a more conventional piece of work. And then when some years later, about 5 years later, Kerouac walked into the offices of Farrar Straus with this endless teletype page and said, "Here's the novel," and Giroux looked at it and sort of saw this gigantic scroll and said, "How am I supposed to edit this thing?
Right.
Couldn't we just, And Kerouac exploded. Not the first time the wounds of the Beats would be self-inflicted, and said, "Nope, there's no way. Not a word is going to be changed. It is what it is," and stalked out and rolled it back up, and then stormed out of the office. But I am very conflicted about Kerouac and his work. I think it's very hard to separate the life of Jack Kerouac, the man who would die at the impossibly young age of 47, and become to the Beats what later Jim Morrison became. If you die young, you get a privileged place in American letters.
Especially if you're creative.
Especially if you're creative.
Yeah.
But if you're also a devoted addict of liquor and other stimulants, in a way, Jack Kerouac was living posthumously from about the age of 30 on. He was already dead when he was alive. His best work was done in a burst of enormous creativity. But he existed outside the privileged circle of the Beats. He was, as Jerzy Kosinski would later put it in a novel, Being There, of his chief protagonist, who liked to watch. Mm-hmm. Jack Kerouac's great strength was that he liked to watch.
Yeah.
When he was at a party, he didn't really participate in the party. He watched everybody else. He wrote it all down. He disguised it. He cast his pixie dust on it. And the great theme of Jack Kerouac's books, when you read them now, it seems to me, in addition to the paean about velocity, it is an American dream of escape. The old stuff that Mark Twain and others, lighting out for the territory. Mm-hmm. Jack Kerouac is always lighting out for the territory. Yes. He's always wanting to, wherever he is, he becomes
American
discontent. Theme. He always wants to leave. He wants to escape the suffering and burdens of history that weigh, as was so famously said by a late philosopher, like a burden, like a nightmare on the brain of the living. So he's always in search of the better party somewhere else where you can achieve some kind of ecstatic transcendence of the condition, of his own condition, which he finds a continual torment. And what is that condition exactly? When you read the books, and why is it he's always breaking off with the women that he is with? Because the great unconfessed or the great subterranean theme of Kerouac's work is the bromance, is the unconfessed homosexuality. is the gayness at the top. I mean, very few people refer to Gore Vidal's one-night stand with Jack Kerouac, recounted in his endearing book of his endearing memoir Palimpsest, written about 25 years ago, in which he recounts the joys of sex with Kerouac in a hotel off of Times Square. But when you look at the misogyny that it riddles the work, when you look at this thing, at least from the standpoint of the woke moment of today, and not even the woke moment of today, but some years ago, it's very striking that this aspect of his torment, along with the Catholicism, along with the very close relationship with his mother, becomes braided throughout the work in very curious ways. I read it, as I say, when I was 15 as well. I was very swept away by it. I wanted to read, like you, I think, everything I could get my hands on. And ultimately, I got my hands on a lot of it. And then in 1974, like you, I found myself apprenticed to mentors and people of a literary bent. And in 1974, I found myself hired as a researcher to a guy named Bob Scheer, who had been the editor of Ramparts magazine. Yeah. I was 21, going on 22. He was 38 years old. He was writing a book whose editor was an editor at McGraw-Hill, and her name was Joyce Johnson. I said, Joyce Johnson? Jesus, Bob, did you know that she was Jack Kerouac's girlfriend? And he said, yeah, but she doesn't like to talk about it, you know? And I said, oh, I gotta meet this woman. So I met Joyce Johnson, and Joyce Johnson was everything that Jack Kerouac was not. In lots and lots of ways. And she would later, in the early 80s, she would write, when she was 47 in 1982 or 83, she wrote a delicious memoir, which I want to use the occasion of the centenary of Jack Kerouac's birth to recommend to people. It's too little known, but it is a minor masterpiece with the imperishable title, Minor Characters. Minor characters, because as you know, if you pick up a book in any of the wonderful books that are in this store, and a shout out to Bird and Beckett, long may you survive and thrive. This is an Aladdin's lamp of a store, or Aladdin's cave. You have only to pick up one of these magical books and rub their spines, and the genie of literature will spring forth. They're full of great spirits. As anyone knows, you pick up a book about surrealism, and there'll be some photographic illustration, and there'll be a photograph, and it'll say sort of left to right, Andre Breton, this person, Salvador Dali, and then there'll be a young woman, or a man, seated between two people who would later become luminaries, and it will say unidentified. And you think to yourself, well, but who was this person who was held in such esteem by the other people at the dinner table that they had been invited to join them? Her memoir, Joyce Johnson's memoir, Minor Characters, gives voice to the unidentified. Most of those unidentified happen to be women, or the girlfriends, the enablers, the people who darned the socks, who put food on the table, who said no matter what kind of dreck or drivel was being written, or genius work, it's really good. Keep going, more. Keep on. So she writes this very sweet, tinged with a very astute eye, but she refuses to dip her pen into the inkwell of nostalgia. So it is written in a very lucid and compelling way. And I would say that if I could sum up in 4 words, her sense of Kerouac and his pals, they were all gas, no brake. And I would just like to quote the last bit of it, which I think gets to some kind of truth about the nature of the work. She writes, characterizing the film that David Amran made called Pull My Daisy with Robert Frank and the others. Kerouac is there, and she writes, Jack, the unseen narrator, is everybody all at once, making perfect, tender, absurd sense, but it's too bad the women are all portrayed as spoil sports. Could I have remembered Jack's voice? Remember, she's writing this many years later. I keep trying to match it to the one I last heard on the phone in 1964 when he called me up out of the blue in terrible drunken loneliness somewhere out there in America. Quote, "You never wanted anything but a little old pea soup." Which wasn't really true, of course, but I cried after he hung up. "So what was that all about?" my companion asks as the final credits flash on the screen. "I think it was about the right to remain children." The 60s were never quite my time. They seemed anticlimactic for all their fireworks. Some culmination had been short-circuited. I saw hippies replace beatniks, sociologists replace poets, the empty canvas replace the Franz Klein. Unenthusiastically, I observed the emergence of lifestyle. The old intensities were blanding out into do your own thing, the commandment of a freedom excised of struggle. Ecstasy had become chemical. Forgetfulness could be had by prescription. Revolution was in the wind, but it never came. And if it had, there would have been no room in its orthodoxies for a Kerouac, who retreated farther and farther from the center of the stage into the dusty wings, out to the back alley, tunneling backward through decades toward the lull of his earliest vision, and finding it a narrow place, the wonder gone from it, making the desolate effort to assume its prejudices, its suspicions, bitter. The pure products of America go crazy, Dr. William Carlos Williams had written. But has it become my own madness not to have outgrown those years when the door first swung open on a world I never managed to explore as completely as I longed to? I'm a 47-year-old woman with a permanent sense of impermanence. If time were like a passage of music, you could keep going back to it till you got it right. And maybe there's something in Kerouac's work full of contradictions and impossible personal torments writ large and even onto the page of literature itself that's somehow rather bewildering to me and paradoxically retains a hold on the American imagination, particularly of adolescence. But like most of the literature of the country, I think it's something to be outgrown.
Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate you saying that. So I went to the Kerouac event at the Beat Museum and was wandering around, and I asked everybody that I stood in front of, I said, well, haven't we overdosed on Kerouac? And I wanted people to say, yes, of course, we, But nobody said that. I mean, there was a black jazz saxophonist who said, no, Jack Kerouac is the perfect antidote to the craziness of the world we're living in now.
How so?
Well, I didn't get into an extensive, he was talking about, he had in mind the Ukraine,
How in the God's name is the work of Jack Kerouac, the music of his sentences, the abundance of his metaphors, the flat-out messiness of it, how in the world is it some kind of answer to what is happening in Ukraine?
Well, he meant things like, he was saying, like compassion. The beats were compassion for living things and other people was part of it.
Well, Allen Ginsberg summed it up very well in a single syllable. Om. Om. If only everyone would om, we would be home.
So, all right, so I didn't get any of the answer that I was hoping to get. So I went home, and then the next day I got an email from the Beat Museum, and they have a long list of a dozen people who've written these eulogies for Kerouac, like David Ulin.
Yes, I read David Ulin. David Ulin was my successor at the LA Times book review. He never met a commonplace or a banality that he didn't want to embrace.
Okay, and that,
I read Ted Gioia's overlong paean to Jack Kerouac.
Yeah.
I read these things. I'm mystified by it.
Well,
it seems to me that the idolization, the iconography that has attached itself, like so many, incrustations. In order to see the man whole, you have to peel off the cliches that now so encrust any consideration of Jack Kerouac as to make any kind of lucid analysis, all but impossible. I was hoping that we could find a way to talk about what accounts for the continuing hold, at least among some, of the work. And I'm willing, certainly, to concede its complications. But I'd love to hear a clear-sided defense of Kerouac and why he remains relevant.
Well, he certainly, you knew all these people all around the country, who've said Kerouac's great, Kerouac's wonderful. So one way that I found
That's like saying box office rules. I mean, that's like saying we're having a serious conversation about literature. We're not going to nail ourselves to the cross that says that which sells best is that which is best from a literary point of view, are we? Because if we go down that route, then we've got to stock this bookstore with a great many other books that sell much better than many of the titles in this store.
So I read Kerouac's, Brinkley edited a lot of Kerouac's letters. And in one of the letters, he says...
Douglas Brinkley, the historian.
Brinkley, yeah. He says the same thing that the narrator says in On the Road. Mm-hmm. I want to be a Negro. A Negro was the word that he used. So, to me, so the character in On the Road is saying the same thing that Jack is saying in his letters. To me, that was like an insight, really. So I see Kerouac, and this is from his, the things that he wrote himself. He described himself as a dumb Canuck, French Canadian, working class. He had a sense of, like, shame, this coming from this culture this ethnic group that had no culture, from his point of view. And he looked out to Black Americans to see that they're the incredible. Here they're oppressed and they're beaten up and abused and mistreated. He knew about that. I mean, he wasn't an activist or, a civil rights person, but he knew all about that. What attracted him was the fact that they were great jazz musicians. Out of the pain and suffering of their lives, they made great jazz.
Now, of course, this is a view which was most memorably codified in Norman Mailer's The White Negro.
Yes. Well,
an essay which has fallen into very considerable disrepute by modern critics, very often of African American heritage, who regard this whole trope of romanticizing African American culture as a somehow more alive culture, richer, more pleasurable, more devoted to the pleasure principle, as something which disaffected white boys and girls should somehow embrace as a kind of double exploitation, a view not thought very much of at the time in which these were first expressed. But it seems to me that anybody today that looks upon these expressions of longing by Kerouac and others at the time is obliged to take them into account, or at least to look at them critically and not to accept wholesale the conceit that they are otherwise at pains to express everywhere in their letters, privately as well as in many of their public expressions. I mean, I can't help but look at those essays now with some considerable dismay and trouble, and I don't accept them on their face the way I did when I was 15
well,
in
okay.
1967.
Well, all right, I guess you've grown up, but it does seem like
Well, I've been forced to grow up.
A lot of the culture has not grown up, at least what I hear you're saying.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it just seems to me that well, just before we open up to the audience, I think we absolutely do want to, because we don't want to have an echo chamber of just our own disobliging thoughts. We do want to have it enriched by a more democratic process.
Rest of us disoblige.
Yeah, and that will be good, because hopefully some of these things will be clarified. But how do you account for or either of you, how do you account for the tremendous echo of enthusiasm that Kerouac has in the general culture.
Well, I don't know if he still has it, though. To be honest, I mean, I feel like
Really? I mean,
he
given
feels to me like he's very out with, say, a sort of millennial crowd doesn't seem that interested in Kerouac to me. You know?
really?
Yeah.
Yes, that's true. Young people do
And-
not. A friend of mine from a small town in central California wanted to walk across the country, not drive, but walk across the country. He started off, Sam Tidwell, he started off by reading on the road and getting into it, and then, you know, the next day he throws the book away. He says, "This is rubbish."
Well, yeah,
You know,
I
that
find
is a
I
typical
find, you know,
response.
at the age of 70, I now find Kerouac about as unreadable as I find most of John Steinbeck. It's hard. It's hard to reread. I think. I mean, it's fantastic when you're 15. Less so at 25, although still pretty good. At 35, you're starting to break out in hives. Much later, I think it's really hard to read. I do think you're right that the Subterraneans is a better book.
So how
and
about
so
if
does
we,
the Donald
how about if
books.
we open this up?
Let's open
now?
it up. Have
You know,
at it.
You start. You had your hand up first.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, when I was 15, I read Another Country by James Baldwin. And I had a similar reaction to what you both had, I think, reading Kerouac. And I think that says something more about what 15-year-olds want, because I think Another Country is a better book than a lot of Kerouac. And I think James Baldwin is probably a better writer. But I wanted something that made adulthood seem different than what I was seeing face to face. So that's an aside. I think the reason that Kerouac survives is his great theme is not about adolescence, and perhaps it's about escape, but I think fundamentally it's about the idea that friendship trumps other relationships. And I think in the United States, with our misogyny, with our Christian repressive view of families and what they can be, I think Kerouac, and admittedly at sometimes very homoerotic friendships, is profoundly powerful. And I'm a recently retired professor, and I definitely knew some millennials who were jazzed by Kerouac. And I agree with you. I don't think he's the favorite, but I think that that is profoundly important, and that that's what Kerouac did. Was he said it's not about family, it's not about politics, it's about your friends and the ability of you and your friends to create your own culture. And I think, you know, we can debate his style, but I think that view of the world is profound and marvelous. And I think it's true. There are a lot of Kerouac that one reads once, and that's plenty. But I also think that that's the nature of the novel. The overwhelming majority of novels we read once, we have a profound experience, and we get on the road and move on to the next. So that's what I think
Okay.
is the power of Kerouac.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate that. Yes, back there, please.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be concise. 2 points. First of all, the white Negro is about a lot more than white kids wanting to be black. And I admit, when I read it at 17, about the same time I read On the Road, and that was in 1969 or 70. Yeah, I was kind of into that, but the white Negro goes beyond that, and I am grateful to Norman Mailer for, at that time I was flirting with atheism, and Mailer said, no, forget, when you read the white Negro, atheism, forget it. On the question about Ukraine, I'm just reminded, first of all, I'm an Orthodox Christian. This is tearing our hearts apart, and it's happening during Lent. There, in the 1500s, Ivan the Terrible was doing something similar. He was attacking another part of Russia, the city of Novgorod, which was a republic, by the way. It was a constitutional monarchy, but it was a republic. He was attacking Novgorod and trying to bring it under his power. And he was doing so during Lent. And Saint Basil, the Holy Fool, and I won't describe what that means because I can't, but it's part of our tradition that there are such people. And Saint Basil came to Novgorod and went up in front of Ivan the Terrible in an act of incredible courage and took a sausage and started eating it, which you can't have meat during Lent. And Ivan the Terrible said, "What are you doing having, you call yourself holy?" He didn't, but what are you doing eating meat during Lent? And he says, "You're murdering people during Lent and you're worried about me eating meat." And I think there's something about the Holy Fool in Jack Kerouac. I can't describe it, I can't I can't describe it, but that's the feeling I get. That Jack Kerouac says there's a subtext to him that even now, after all these years and after having, I read On the Road 3 times, the last time was about 15 years ago. There's a subtext to him that some people will get, and I hope they do. And I think it has something to do, as that musician said, with this war, with holy foolishness.
So I wrote a novel that's called Beat Blues. There's some copies over here. And the Kerouac and Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti are characters in the novel. And then there's the main woman character is a woman named Natalie Jackson. Now there was a real woman named Natalie Jackson who came from New Jersey to San Francisco and worked in I. Magnin and met the Beats and lived with Robert Lavinia, the artist. And so usually the way that Natalie is described in Kerouac's books, it says Neil Cassidy's girlfriend. So she was Neil Cassidy's girlfriend, or they lived together, they were lovers. So Natalie, I would say partially because she was abused by Neil Cassidy, also because she was taking drugs, and maybe because she was paranoid. I mean, she would say to Jack and Neil, you know, the life that you're leading, you know, is coming to an end. The police are going to come after you and your whole circle. And, you know, there's going to be brutal repression here. This is not going to go on. So Natalie and Neil were living together in an apartment in San Francisco, and she was kind of unstable. And Neil had to go off to work on the railroad, his job on the railroad. And he said to Jack, "Would you please stay here and keep an eye on Natalie and make sure that she's safe?" Well, Jack failed to do that. Natalie jumped, or either she jumped or was pushed or slipped from the fire escape on the 3rd floor and fell to the pavement and died. She was only wearing a man's T-shirt. So when the police arrived, there was nothing to identify her. So she was taken to the morgue and the coroner. She was identified as Jane Doe.
and Neil came and identified her. So there were limits to the friendship. You know, when it came to Natalie Jackson, neither Jack nor Neil could really be there for her. I mean, maybe nobody could have been there for her. So at first, Jack was going to write a novel about Natalie Jackson, and he called her Rosie Buchanan. There are 3 scenes in Dharma Bums in which Rosie Buchanan appears, but Jack decided to not to write a novel about Natalie Jackson, but to write about Gary Snyder, who became the central figure in the Dharma Bums. I mean, that's the area that he feels comfortable with, writing about another man and this friendship between the 2 men and their experiences that they go on. So that was definitely a limitation, that he couldn't have loving relationships with women that lasted more than, a one-night stand. I mean, he couldn't even really have it with his own daughter, whom he didn't recognize, and he didn't relate. Well, he had it with his mother. He went back after being on the road. He always went back to be with his mother. Yeah, so I would say, as a culture, we're still caught up.
I mean, I gotta say, leaving the literature aside, and that's saying a lot, because really it's what counts at the end of the day is the writing, and the lives, as is often the case, the lives of creative people and uncreative people are very messy. But it is striking. I mean, I appreciate what you say about the need to forge a family, although in Kerouac's case, it was less of a family, to your point, than it was trying to forge a brotherhood. And it was semper fi. I mean, it was, yes, loyalty, all that, but the collateral damage, the roadkill, which were mostly women, not always, is quite striking. I mean, you mentioned this case, but there are others who threw themselves off of fire escapes in New York. There were others in San Francisco that were murdered and abused, who were among the enablers. There's a whole galaxy of the unidentified. And, it is impossible for me to read these things and not take some of this into account as so when I look at, I mean, I'm sorry to sound sort of a bit sort of straight bourgeois here, but what is it that I romanticized at 15? Yeah, the flight out of straight-jacketed, normal American families whose suffocations had squeezed out any ounce of creativity, and it seemed that everybody was being programmed to become the organization men of the same theme of William White's book, so famous in the 50s, and that we were all being put into these tracks, and we're going to be minted, and we were going to be good soldiers and good citizens and this inchoate rebellion, which Ginsberg and the others gave enormous articulation to, was extraordinarily important. It was, as Leonard Cohen would so famously put it much later, it was a crack in the Liberty Bell through which the light could shine through. But that crack, really, a lot of people who did it were pretty cracked. And one of the things that we're romanticizing here is if a flight from responsibility. You come to a town, you make a mess, and you leave a lot of broken china on the floor. You pass out in a stupor, somebody else cleans up the mess. You go on to some other. Finally, Kerouac rebelled against the rebellion. And he basically put himself under house arrest, drank himself to death, and came to dinner with Mama. And became quite a reactionary politically. I mean, his demons really got to him. And in a way, as I had said earlier, he began to live posthumously. It was a slow suicide, really. And the writing that we revere was really created in a strong, astonishing burst of creativity. And then he was killed also by fame. he was unable to deal with
Yes.
the fame. The fame really destroyed him, and it destroys lots of people. And he was completely unequipped to deal with it. And that was I'm tempted to say it was a new kind of phenomenon in American life, but it wasn't really. I mean, F. Scott Fitzgerald was also killed by fame and his own inner demons,
Yeah,
and he too
earlier.
was part of a generation. But we have a kind of addiction, it seems to me, as a culture, in fixing labels. Even the whole idea of a generation is a very dubious one. There were other people who were born in 1925 and 26 and 27 who went on to be very considerable poets, who are not considered part of the Beat generation. But there was something about coming up with the moniker Beat, which Kerouac is said to have come up with, and then which our own Herb Caen in the pages of the San Francisco Chronicle coined the Beatnik, which coincided with the Sputnik, and suddenly it really was all Madison Avenue. Suddenly, for all their rebellions, for all the howl that Ginsberg articulated so amazingly, movingly, and wonderfully, he was, of course, he didn't need to hire any press agents because he was his own astonishing pressman, able to, make possible this notion of a beat generation, which quickly began to be used by the media as a cudgel to try to beat them into submission. So the dialectic between the authentic grappling with the contradictions and paradoxes and ironies of American culture, which had both inflamed the popular imagination and also sought to crush it at the same time, which is baked into the best of their work, I think does deserve to be honored, and the centenary of Kerouac's birth is an occasion to begin to do that. But I think, to quote Ferlinghetti, we should not check our critical faculties at the title page. We should keep an open mind, but not so open that our brains fall out.
So, Garrett, I see you looking at your notes. Would you like to
Well-
come in here and come back to what you were, some of your thoughts?
I mean, I don't know. I was coming at this more from the impression that young people don't like Kerouac anymore. Is more where I was thinking people are coming from these days. I mean,
Well, the title of the City Lights event was Still Outside.
yeah. Well, I mean, what I was interested in reading Subterraneans this time around, I mean, is that it's not really there's nothing heroic in the Subterraneans, really. I mean, it's like, I sort of zeroed in on what's probably the worst passage in terms of the Beat generation sort of replicating various, value systems of the dominant culture vis-a-vis sexuality or gender or race or what have you. And I was interested in this passage, doubts, and this is the beginning of the paragraph, doubts, therefore, of, Margot's Negro. Naturally, not only my mother, but my sister, whom I may have to live with someday, and her husband a Southerner, and everybody concerned, would be mortified to hell and have nothing to do with us. Like it would preclude completely the possibility of living in the South, like that Faulknerian pillar homestead in the old Grandad Moonlight I'd so long envisioned for myself. And there I am with Dr. Whitley, pulling out the panel of my roll-top desk, and we drink to the great books, and outside the cobwebs on the pines and the old mules clopping the soft roads. What would they say if my mansion lady wife was a black Cherokee? It would cut my life in half, and all such sundry awful American as if to say white ambition thoughts, or white daydreams. And this is sort of followed by like a worse passage that I don't even really want to quote, but about his doubts about Margot's body itself. He has this kind of hysterical hallucination of there being something in her vagina. Like it's not even fully articulated because I think they're having to dance around the censorship issue. It's vile, and there's plenty of vile things in Kerouac, but it still doesn't make me want to disown it insofar as, this is the 100th anniversary of this guy. This guy was born 100 years ago. And it wouldn't occur to me to expect him to have any kind of contemporary purchase on race any more than it would occur to me that Thackeray would have a sort of valid purchase on racial relationships. But what I think gets oversimplified about Kerouac is we act as if we're catching him unawares of his racism and sexism and things of this nature. But in these examples, he's putting he's putting out his own prejudices as these failures and why this relationship totally didn't work, and the idea that non-white women have some weird alien vagina is the most American idea I can think of. It's American as apple pie. This is a very common thing. And so what I feel though is that he's grappling with the Subterraneans. He's grappling with the ugliness of America, and he is failing to actually transcend it at all. And but it is worth. His failure is worth putting in context that, the United States was an apartheid nation in 1958. It was codified in the law, and it's still a white supremacist nation. There wouldn't be a Black Lives Matter movement if it wasn't a white supremacist nation. And so I'm interested in the fact that the Subterraneans, it's not putting a good gloss on any of this. It's showing what a failure he is to overcome the society in which he is. To me.
Yeah. So when you were talking, it reminded me of this passage that I found earlier from On the Road, in which he's describing himself. He and Neil Cassidy go to the movies, and they just sit there and they just watch the movies over and over and over again. And he describes the audience and what's happening, and people slugged out of bottles and turned around and looked everywhere in the dark theater for something to do, somebody to talk to. In the head, everybody was guiltily quiet. Nobody talked. In the gray dawn that puffed ghost-like about the windows of the theater and hugged its eaves, I was sleeping with my head on the wooden arm of a seat as 6 attendants of the theater converged with their night's total of swept-up rubbish and created a huge, dusty pile that reached to my nose as I snored head down, till they almost swept me away too. This was reported to me by Dean, who was watching from 10 seats behind. All the cigarette butts, the bottles, the matchbooks, the come and the gone were swept up in this pile. Had they taken me with it, Dean would never have seen me again. He would have had to roam the entire United States and look in every garbage pail from coast to coast before he found me, embryonically convoluted among the rubbishes of my life, his life, and the life of everybody concerned and not concerned. What would I have said to him from my rubbishy room? Don't bother him, man. I'm happy where I am. This sort of, he's describing himself as, kind of rubbish and garbage, and probably how he really felt about himself. It's very low self-esteem.
I think there's a tendency to overestimate how much of a celebration any of this material is. That a lot of it is very grim.
Very grim.
And it's,
Yeah.
I don't, I feel like that the Beat Generation made tons of mistakes, but it was one of the first popular attempts to try to subvert the sort of dominant culture's value system regarding race and sex and gender and all that stuff. It doesn't mean they did it well, but I do think there was a, I think we're in a position to be able to critique it because it happened. That, them, the Beat Generation happening, it sort of, gave us it changed it changed some prevailing attitudes, even if there's, again, it replicated tons of terrible attitudes.
Yeah, well,
If we've made any progress since then, it's part of the progress, even if it was fucked up, to me.
well, it sort of seems like growing up as whether these group of young men growing up in American society after World War II. It's the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war, the apartheid society, the sort of hatred of women. How do you make room for yourself? Have any kind of sense of dignity and freedom in this, this kind of really locked down society. I mean, I remember reading On the Road at 15 and playing.
The truth will out.
Well, I read it many other times too, but I know that it was important to me at the time.
That's just a case of arrested development. Go
Well,
ahead, go ahead.
So so Steve, when I wrote my book about Howl, I read, people criticized Howl, the poem Howl, Ginsberg's Howl. They said, well, this is just adolescent. And I kind of fell back into the position of defending adolescence. I mean, we've all been adolescent. It's a phase that we go through, and there's probably some part of us that still has an adolescence. Let's not bury our adolescence.
Yeah, I personally would never regard Howl as the cry of an adolescence. To me, it's first of all, to me, it's certainly a masterpiece. I think and very much self-consciously, self-confessedly on Ginsberg's part, inspired by Whitman, and and it's a prophetic piece of work. But
Okay, all right.
I don't know. I mean, I wonder if it is. I mean, it may be true what you say that millennials aren't reading Kerouac, but I wonder.
It's my impression.
I wonder.
His
I mean,
star has
just
dimmed
that
quite a
City
bit.
Lights. I wonder what the impression of the clerks are. Who comes in and buys On the Road, or buys Kerouac? And I would be surprised if it weren't. I mean, it does sell in in considerable numbers. I mean,
Sure.
it's a mainstay, and I would be surprised. I actually think part of the interesting aspect of this centenary, I suspect Kerouac has jumped a generation in two. It has achieved a much longer life, particularly On the Road, and some of the other titles in it pulling them along, and I don't think it's because it's assigned reading in like American literature classes. I think people discover it on their own very often, word of mouth, and yes, I think a lot of 15 and 16 and 17-year-olds are still reading it and get excited by it.
Well, one
I
of
would
the
be
things,
surprised
after
if
I
that
read
wasn't
On the
true.
Road,
Yeah.
I learned about Kerouac. I played football, and I also, played the flute and played jazz flute. And people made fun of me, and I said, well, Kerouac did this, so why can't I be a jock, and why can't I be a jazz musician too? So that was validating of, of a 15-year-old in, 1957, and
Right.
when the world seemed to be clean and out
Right.
of shape.
So maybe we should take a few more questions and then have concluding summations for the jury, and then you can deliberate and bring back the verdict. But anybody else have a comment or a question? What do you think are some of the issues that, as you think about Kerouac in this centenary, that either seem to you to cry out to be talked about, that are not talked about so much, or what for you, sort of why are you here? Why do you think Kerouac is so interesting and important that you would take some hours on a Tuesday evening to come to listen to some kind of discussion? Yeah.
I wasn't 15, I was about 18 when I read Kerouac. A friend of mine, I came back from my freshman year of college. My best friend said, "I've got a book. You've got to read it." And within about 4 months, I had dropped out of college, hitchhiked up and down the East Coast. It was just radically changed my life. I left suburban New Jersey.
Right.
And read as much as I could, daydreamed as much as I could. But what brings me here tonight, what brought me here tonight, was the sense of centennial, and a sense that Kerouac was a very, very influential force in my life. But in recent years, I can't read him. I read him and I think, what was I thinking? And I feel bad about that. And so the discussion has been very, very meaningful for me. Maybe it's because I've grown up. I love the comment about the holy fool. Maybe this is something that will give me a little more. I don't know, a little more something to kind of hang on to. And maybe that's it. Maybe I want to hang on a little more to someone who was so meaningful at a time. One of you said, I really connected with Kerouac. I didn't. I had never met anyone who was doing what he was doing. And so a whole new world opened up. That I had never imagined. So yeah, I'm here, I guess, maybe, kind of reaching out for strings, just trying to hold on just a little bit more.
Today I went to my branch of the library, the Sunset branch of the library, and I took James Joyce's Ulysses out. So, because it's also this anniversary, Joyce anniversary. And I'm kind of, wondering, I first read Ulysses, not when I was 15, but when I was 19 years old. I thought it was great. I mean, it was the year that I read Proust and Thomas Mann and Kafka. But I'm wondering, am I gonna just be in love with Ulysses the same way I was when I was 19 years old? It might not be. I might say, what, do I have to wade through all these words and where I can't figure out what the fuck he's trying to say here?
That raises a great question that we've sort of danced around. I would say one of the defining features of a work that history confers the appellation a classic. What is a classic piece of art? What is a master? It's a work, whether musical, painting, sculpture, or literature, which, as it falls through time and circumstance, both in your own life and in the lives of subsequent generations of people who come to it, continues to give off meaning. So, for example, there are books that you read at 15. I read Crime and Punishment when I was 15. I read it for the plot. I read it at 25. I read it at 35. Proust I had bought 40 years ago, and it stood on my shelves like an Everest, defining the far horizon of literature. And every time I would periodically try to read, I'd get through about 150 pages of Swan's Way, and I would give up. Finally, 10 years ago, I had one of my sons was in college, and he was taking a great books course. So I decided to give myself the pleasure of reading behind him without having to write the papers or do the tests. And I read through Swan's Way in a great gulp, the Lydia Davis translation, one spring. The summer came, the summer went. And then finally around Labor Day, I looked at those 3 volumes in the Scott Moncrief, Terence Kilmartin translations that Random House had published in the early 80s. And I thought, I think I'm going to try to tackle the 3,000 pages and the 1.2 million words. And I started reading and I read it. I keep reading and keep reading. 4 months later, I'm finally standing atop Mount Marcel. And I gotta say, the view was extraordinary from that top in a way that I would not have appreciated had I read that book at 19, because I had lived some in my life. And I remember I was then, one of my closest friends was the late Christopher Hitchens. He lay dying of esophageal cancer. I would visit him in MD Anderson Center in Houston, and I was reading the Proust, and I would come, and he knew his Proust very well. He had reviewed the Lydia Davis translation for the Atlantic, and I came in to the ICU unit where he was then all hooked up, and he said, "What are you reading?" I said, "Proust." And he looked at me with a baleful and envious eye and said, "I truly envy you. You have waited to the right moment in your life." And I think that is one of the things that helps define whether a book is thickly textured, has enough nutritive value so that you can come to it and it can reveal itself and reveal new ways for you to connect with it, even ways in which the author himself or herself never actually consciously intended when they. That is the
Yes.
that is the great definition of work. And if the work fails to do that, I mean, of course, the appreciation of any work is deeply subjective. I mean, nothing that anybody says here may mean or carry any weight with anybody, and your view is just as good as anybody else's because it's a very personal relation that you have. But I would say that if a work fails to speak to subsequent generations, or they find it impossible to connect with it, then that work becomes hostage to the moment of the historical occasion for which it first appeared, and is a kind of inert, interesting cultural artifact, perhaps to be studied by academics who want to tease out, how did a particular milieu get created and why was it important in that moment. But if it fails to live and find new readers, then it's really become dead. And the question for me with respect to Kerouac is, what of Kerouac's work continues to speak to us? It can speak to us about what it meant at its time, the great breaking of the Cold War consensus and the stultifications of the era. But how and in what way does it speak now to us? And that's the question for me that remains worth exploring and unanswered yet.
Yeah, well, I would definitely say that Howl is a classic. It has appealed to people decade after decade
Right.
after decade. But there also say that there are some writers and some books that they go on being read year after year, decade after decade, and a lot of it is junk, like Jack London, for me. The Call of the Wild. It's an overblown, overpraised story about a dog that has a lot of racist, sexist undertones. But
How do you feel about The Iron Heel?
probably, it's got some. I mean, Ernest Everhard, a little this sexist, supposed to be this male sex symbol. It's kind of also overblown. It has some good moments in it, some prophetic aspects of it, but also is sort of typical of Jack London, where he was of two minds about everything. He wrote this, to build a fire. In one version, the guy builds a fire and survives. In the other version, he doesn't. Well, he has two endings in The Iron Heel, where the revolution is wiped out and everybody's destroyed, and then 1,000 years in the future, the Brotherhood of Man is created. So he couldn't make up his mind about anything, really. So. I know Tolstoy, not Tolstoy, but Trotsky loved it, thought it was really good. But there's a book that when it first came out, nobody really liked it. It was only when fascism came around, people said, "Oh, this is a prophetic work,"
Yeah.
And then I went to Vietnam and I found that people were reading The Iron Heel because they thought it had something to say about America and the American war that they were fighting.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think ultimately, for me, it's like, there's plenty of problems with Kerouac, but I never walk away from it thinking this motherfucker can't write. It's like he's a highly skilled writer, and that goes a long way. You know, that his prose at its best, he's as good a prose writer as wrote novels to me in the American 20th century. I'm always way more. I'm always ready to not be impressed by it. And I'm always impressed by it. You know, just as the sheer skill he has as a guy putting together sentences. You know, and that goes a long way towards sustaining one's reputation, I think.
I would like to read from Lonesome Traveler, which is nonfiction. This is maybe these days my favorite Kerouac book. And what I'm going to read, it's called The Railroad Earth. And what I'm going to read, hopefully from beginning to end, it's like, this is one sentence. There was a little alley in San Francisco back of the Southern Pacific Station at 3rd and Townsend in red brick of drowsy, lazy afternoons, with everybody at work in offices. In the air you feel the impending rush of their commuter frenzy. As soon as they'll be charging en masse from market and Sansom buildings, on foot and in buses, and all well dressed, through working man Frisco and walk-up truck drivers, and even the poor grime bemarked 3rd Street of lost bums, even Negroes so hopeless and long left east, and meanings of responsibility and try that now all they do is stand there spitting in the broken glass, sometimes 50 in one afternoon against one wall at 3rd and Howard, and here's all these Millbrae and San Carlos neat necktied producers and commuters of America and steel civilization rushing by with San Francisco Chronicles and green call bulletins, not even enough time to be disdainful. They've got to catch 130, 132, 134, 136, all the way up to 146, until the time of evening supper in homes of the railroad earth, when high in the sky the magic stars ride above the following hotshot freight trains. It's all in California. It's all a sea. I swim out of it in afternoons of hot sun. Meditation in my jeans with head on handkerchief, on brakeman's lantern, or if not working on books, I look up at blue sky of perfect lost purity and feel the warp of wood of old America beneath me, and have insane conversations with Negroes in several store windows above, and everything is pouring in, the switching moves of boxcars in that little alley, which is so much like the alleys of Lowell, and I hear far off, in the sense of coming night, that engine calling our mountains.
Well, you know, I'm just going to play the contrarian here.
Go right ahead.
This passage evinces so much contempt for ordinary people as to be breathtaking. And the romanticization of the down and out, the refuse of the country, and the audacity. I mean, in this, he bears an uncanny relationship to the short stories of John Cheever. You know, the commuters from Connecticut who are going into Manhattan, the 110, the 310 on Metro North, people, a tremendous number of people formerly of the working class who are who are coming into the middle class, people who came in after the Second World War. They get to Levittown, they get to Daly City, the little ticky-tacky boxes. They're trying to make lives for themselves. They're trying to bring home, make an honest living, bring home money. He has contempt for them. He pisses all over them. He romanticizes drunks. He romanticizes people who don't make an honest living. And from this, because he writes a run-on sentence, we say this is literature? No wonder Trump is winning. No wonder the outcasts from the bohemian shores of the precincts of Manhattan, some of the most provincial places I have ever been in, to the self-congratulatory conceits of North Beach. No wonder in these precincts are regarded with opprobrium by millions of Americans who he has contempt for, who followed his lines. And the caricature of these people, the lack of empathy baked into peerless,
Well,
magic, pixie dust prose that catches your ear is a magician's trick.
well,
And it's shameful.
I don't
It's something to be ashamed of
I don't
and not
s-
to be lionized.
Steve, I don't see it that way. I don't.
I know
feel
you
it that
don't,
way.
but that's why I'm giving voice to it. This is a contrarian view that you will not hear expressed by and large, but it is a part of this worldview. And finally, he himself revolts from his view and runs back to Mama in shame and lives with her and embraces the most reactionary kind of Catholicism and right-wing view of America. You know?
Well, I don't
It's really,
think
it's really
if
pickled
you're-
in a particular kind of prejudice, which I think is should be a source of some embarrassment.
I'm not sure. Well, let me ask you. I've been meaning to ask you this. If you were at Viking back in the day, would you have accepted or rejected On the Road? Would you have published it?
That's impossible to know in back in those days. I hope I would have had the wit to have understood that this was a fresh voice that we hadn't heard from, and that probably there was a whole bunch of people that would probably, and that this was a bestseller in the making. And hopefully, if I was any good as an editor, I would have my tuning fork on the being, pressed
Yeah.
down, and I would be in sync with a zeitgeist that was about to break, and I'd be ahead of the curve, so I could get that great laudatory review by Stephen Milstein in the New York Times, which called it a masterpiece, and he was not wrong. But I'm just trying to say that there is a subterranean current in that masterpiece, which evinces a shameful contempt for the lives of ordinary people, and it elevates in a self-aggrandizing way he and his comrades who are anointed with a prophetic sensibility which is denied to other ordinary people in the country. And
Yeah.
he has the talent to make the case in a brilliant way.
Yes, in the back there.
Hi, so I haven't read Kerouac for many years, but all the, I'm not sure what my question is, but I find the whole way that he ran home to, he grew up in Lowell, right, and then he basically spent the last 10, 15 years of his life with his mother in Gainesville or going back and forth, and for me, that's what seems so sort of like relatable or charming about him, and almost used to make me want to reread him. But yeah, like I did my reading at 15, which is like 35 years ago or whatever. But like what does that actually express, or how can we look back at his writing, knowing that he basically died drunk in a small town in Florida, having completely renounced all of that other stuff that happened to him, and that he died in obscurity. Like for me, like you're talking about that. As in, like, look, he did that. That makes him, like, kind of, but that makes him probably endearing. But again, I haven't looked at it for a long time. At this point in my life, the poetry seems to be most resonant, and I haven't read his poetry for years.
Yeah.
So, like, Mexico City Blues. But I'm not sure what I'm asking, but I feel like there's something that you could say about the whole, like, the way that he just died with his mother as, like, his only friend, or
Well, he
something.
did have his third wife with him also.
He had a wife, okay, but
Yes.
I don't know. I'm not really saying anything except I like thinking.
And he had a sister, and he had a brother-in-law. I mean.
The truth was that he became more important to the myth of the beats as a dead martyr than as a living writer.
Right, so he had a lot of fame for a while, and then it tapered off, right? And then
Yeah.
it came back, because I grew up in like the 80s, and I know at that point people were kind of obsessed with him after I think he hadn't been looked at for a while, and or maybe I'm wrong and it had been consistent, I don't remember. And he seems to go kind of like go back and forth. So that's all.
Okay. Somebody else? Yes, please.
I remember having a discussion with some friends, and one of them said that Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck was a better work, description of America at that time. And in that book, Steinbeck describes the integration of a school in New Orleans by a small black girl. I think she was only about 8 or 9, all by herself. And we know about I think most of us know about the Little Rock Nine. She was all by herself. And Steinbeck examined her situation. And one of my friends contrasted that positively against Kerouac, who he saw as just as hedonistic. And then when we were all finished talking, somebody said, but when we all read On the Road, didn't it make us want to go on the road? And we all agreed, yes, it did. And I think that's part of, I think that's a central part of his appeal, that it makes you want to light out for the territories.
Yes.
Yeah. And explore yourself in the process, not just the country.
Well, I think we should probably wrap up because I
Yeah.
think we've been at it for
But
about
this
an hour and a
this
half. and I
woman
wanna
wants to
try
say something, so.
people's patience.
I just have one last question. I'm more in favor of hearing from living writers than talking that much about dead ones. So did you bring a poem that you could, or have a poem in your mind you could share with us? Or,
I mean,
sorry to put you on the spot, but
I don't have anything with me unless Eric has one of my books in the.
I would have to scramble to find it.
oh, sorry.
Well,
So what's
how about
the most
this? How
recent
about-
book we should find of yours?
How about this? Bird and Beckett, Tuesday Night, Kerouac. Author of On the Road, here he goes, zoom, 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 eating up gas, blowing out tigers, evading the police, waving at Steve, hop on board, pal, enjoy the ride. That's the best I can do off the top of my head.
Well done.
Well, this is for you. This is a book I did, and that's with a photographer.
Great.
From the beach to the punks.
Good. Well, I think this was, I hope this will have proved a lively and contentious and by turns provocative discussion, the likes of which you will probably not hear anywhere else in this great year.
I think that's probably true.
I think it's probably true.
Yeah, somebody has to do it.
Somebody has to do it.
Might as well be you.
Thanks. Good job.
Steve, thanks for coming.
You bet.